David Schonfeld. I've known David since his days at the Yale Child Study Center years ago. I can tell you that David knows through experience, far-reaching insight, and scientific study more than anyone else I know about how to most effectively, therapeutically, and humanistically respond to school crises. David?
So I wanted to begin, if you can advance to the next slide. I wanted to begin by just acknowledging that there actually are a very wide range of reactions that may be seen after a school shooting. I think most well appreciated by the general public are the post-traumatic reactions and disorders, but that's not all that you will see. For those children who lost someone they care about, bereavement might be the predominant issue for them. I remember going to respond to one community shooting that had occurred, and there was a young man who had the unfortunate circumstance that the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he was uninjured. I met with him several weeks after the shooting occurred. He had come back to school once, but was unable to remain there. And as I talked with him in his home, I asked him why he wasn't receiving counseling. And he looked at me and he said, I had some trauma symptoms for the first several days, but I wasn't aware what was happening during the shooting, and those symptoms went away. I had some trouble sleeping, I was jittery, I was distracted. But he said, that's better now. And he said, I don't want to go and talk about the shooting anymore. So then I asked him, why did you leave school? And he said, it didn't feel right to be there without her. He was on a date with a girl he planned to marry. And being in school without his girlfriend didn't seem right to him. And I looked at him and I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he looked surprised and he said, that's it. And if someone's willing to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling now. I don't want to talk about the shooting anymore. So the issue is, it isn't just one set of reactions, and additional reactions, even beyond those, should be anticipated. A crisis is generally followed by a cascade of secondary losses and stressors. Now, while this is clearly evident after a natural disaster, I've seen it in school shootings as well. So just as an example, after a school shooting, there may be a drop in enrollment in the school for a number of reasons. Students may transfer out because of discomfort in either returning or remaining in the school. But students who are doing well may also transfer out, just because the teachers and other students who are struggling may be impacting their academic career. Future students and their families are often reluctant to join the school. And the drop in enrollment then has a financial impact. The issue is the budget in school is based on the number of students there. And when there are less students, they have less money. I've even seen property value drop in these towns, and that leads to a drop in income from taxes that come from property, as well as the inability for them to pass tax levies. And what then occurs is the schools have fixed expenses. So what do they cut? They cut the supportive services at a time when the schools are most struggling, and you can see how that can lead to a downward spiral. But it's not just everything that follows the crisis you have to worry about, it's also everything that preceded. Major crisis events also uncover prior trauma or loss, even if it's completely unrelated to the event. I got a phone call on the day after the shooting and the concert in Las Vegas from a school that I had provided some training to beforehand. And they said, we looked for this and we found it. We were fortunate none of our students were at the concert, and none of our members of our school community died in that event. But we had a student here sobbing because she's afraid her mother's going to die of cancer. So the issue is you uncover other concerns in children and staff. If you go to the next slide, unfortunately, there's a lot there to uncover. Trauma and loss is common in the lives of children just as it is in adults. 1 out of 20 children in our country will experience the death of a parent, and 9 out of 10 will experience the death of a close relative or friend by the time they complete high school. Now, in contrast to this high prevalence of loss in the lives of children, training of classroom educators in this area is extremely limited. Less than 10% of educators receive even a single lesson on how to support grieving children. And teachers report this is the main reason that they don't approach or are willing to provide support to grieving students. They're afraid they may say or do the wrong thing and upset children or make matters worse, so they opt instead to say nothing. But saying nothing says an awful lot to children. It lets them know that you either are unaware, unconcerned, unwilling, or unable to help. We also need to, though, I don't want to fault the educators. We need to recognize that school professionals are impacted by these events at least as much as the students, and often more so. I remember talking with a superintendent of a school system that had had a bus accident that led to the multiple deaths of students 2 years prior. And as he was talking to me about this, he became tearful, and he looked at me and he said, you know, it still bothers me that these kids died. And he asked me, maybe I should retire. And I looked at him and I said, if you ever wake up one morning and you don't care if the kids die, you have to retire. The issue is that's a pretty low bar, from my opinion, to be a leader in a school system. So if you go to the next slide, I think it's important that we continue to provide support to students and staff until the recovery is completed, and that may take many months and often takes years. But the time frame for federal funding for recovery, whether from the U.S. Department of Ed or FEMA, isn't aligned with the timeline for recovery, and the grants often end too soon. And the amount of funding is often less than the scope of need. Go to the next slide. New York City schools conducted a needs assessment of students attending grades 4 through 12 throughout all boroughs in New York City about 6 months after 9/11. And they found that approximately 1 of 4 students surveyed reported symptoms consistent with at least one mental health disorder. That included post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, separation anxiety disorder, panic attacks, and agoraphobia. That suggested that more than 250,000 students in that school system alone needed counseling. What was also concerning was 87%, nearly 9 out of 10 students, reported at least one trauma symptom that was still persisting 6 months after 9/11. And of note, the majority of students who were self-reporting symptoms and also reported daily impairment in their functioning also reported that they had never received nor even sought mental health treatment in the school, despite the fact that there was free counseling available in every school in the city through funding from FEMA. Go to the next slide. So we can't rely on individual treatment services alone to address the broad range of needs for supportive and therapeutic services after a school shooting. The school response is simply not the same as providing individual evaluation, referral, and treatment to everyone in a school building. After a school shooting, you really need to look at other approaches to provide additional support to children beyond a traditional mental health service model. Teachers, school administrators, and staff can have a positive and profound impact on children by providing compassionate support as well as identifying students who need additional mental health services. The preferred model to effect the development of a compassionate, supportive school and community is to educate and train all professionals in a child's caring community, building their capacity to respond long term. Now, we've seen some excellent examples of resiliency and strength among students and staff, and I had the opportunity to spend much of this week in Broward County, meeting with the staff and others there. But I do want to point out that no matter how resilient someone is, it doesn't mean they're not experiencing distress. It simply means that they have the capacity to cope with the trauma, loss, and adversity that they're experiencing, and they need our help as well. And although resilient students, I think, have done an excellent job of coming forward to represent the needs of their community and their peers, we also need to recognize that they're not necessarily representative of all of the members of that community. And there are some members of those communities who are particularly struggling to the point they cannot even speak about it. And they look and see other examples of kids who appear to be doing much better, and that can even add further to their distress in the sense that they're not competent. If you go to the next slide. This training, though, has not been a priority in teacher preparation, coursework, nor in professional development. Instead, it is often sought only in the aftermath of a major event. In the disaster field, we refer to this as just-in-time training. But to be quite honest, it is not in time. I remember being put in touch with a parent and an educator in the Newtown community about 3 or 4 weeks after the shooting at Sandy Hook. And he had a child who was attending Sandy Hook and was struggling, and he wanted some advice on what he could do. So I spent about an hour with him on the phone that evening. And at the end of the call, he said, you know, I really want to thank you for this. This is the first advice that I've gotten that's practical that I can actually use. He said, I don't want to be judgmental, but I just want to ask, why wasn't there someone like you in my community sooner brought in by the school system to help give me this advice? And I said to him, there was. The shooting happened on Friday. On Monday morning, I did an in-service for all of the staff in the school system. You were either home with your family, which I completely understand, or more likely, you were there and you don't remember a word that I said. But I went over the same things I just went over in the phone call. We need to recognize that preparedness involves not just preparing to respond to a crisis, but also preparing to recover, and we have to invest the resources. And as already mentioned, these skills and strategies are not just important in communities such as Newtown, Connecticut, or Parkland and Coral Springs, Florida. After these events, I heard repeatedly how shocking it was that violence such as these shootings could occur in communities such as that. And it reminded me of a presentation I had conducted in an urban community known for its gang violence. I talked in that community about how communities characterized by chronic violence and cumulative loss, the children there don't get used to the death of their peers. Although they may stop seeking support from adults, because they've come to believe that the adults in their community are either unable or unwilling to stop, prevent, or help them cope with these events. And this falsely leads people to believe they're not impacted anymore. Now, one of the staff spoke up, and he said that I didn't understand the community, and that here it was normal for children to be part of gangs. And then he added, in this community, it's normal for children to murder other children. And I looked at him and I said, that is never normal. And once we call it normal, it means we stop doing something about it. And I said, I'm not going to be okay about that. I don't think any of us should. So yes, I think we should be outraged that a school shooting happened in these communities, but we should be outraged when it happens anywhere in our community or in our country. So the solutions we seek need to be broadly relevant, and they need to be applied in all communities in our country. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the recommendations of the National Commission on Children in Disasters was that Congress and the Education Department should award funding to states to implement and evaluate training and professional development programs to teach educators basic skills in providing support to grieving students and students in crisis. And they will see those students every day in their classes. And they also should establish statewide requirements related to teacher certification and recertification. And a similar recommendation was also in the final reports of the Disaster Mental Health Subcommittee of the National Biodefense Science Board Federal Advisory Committee, as well as the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission. Going to the next slide. This training for teachers and other school personnel should address the impact of trauma and bereavement on children and their learning, some of the likely reactions that they may see in themselves and others in the school, and most importantly, practical strategies for providing psychological first aid, brief supportive services, bereavement support, and needed academic accommodations, as well as indications for referral for additional mental health services. The goal is to help educators and other school personnel create a supportive environment. So I want to end my comments by highlighting just one free resource that's available to assist with part of this goal. The New York Life Foundation and the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement that I direct convened 10 of the leading professional organizations to form the coalition to support grieving students, all with the common goal of remedying the gap in training of school professionals to ensure that no child has to grieve in isolation. This is a listing of the 10 lead organizations that were the founding members of the coalition, representing both teachers, major teachers unions, school administrators, principals, superintendents, and school counselors, nurses, psychologists, and social workers. But if you go to the next slide, there are 30 more organizations that have also endorsed the material and have added their logos to it. Includes the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American School Health Association, ASCD, Boys and Girls Club of America, Save the Children, and many more. And if you go to the next slide, we've had another 30 members who have joined as friends of the coalition. So the coalition is now up to over 60 organizations. And so there's some materials that I've left here for the coalition. I just want to add, they are publicly available. They are free of charge. You can get them at grievingstudents.org. It has a wide range of materials. And you'll also see some materials about our center that also provides free technical support and consultation. So thank you.